In a distant galaxy where stars burned blue and the planets spun slowly through ancient silence, there was one station that floated like a lonely island between empires, a neutral ground where trade deals were signed and where war was paused for just a breath. And inside that metal world, among merchants and smugglers, among soldiers and spies, there walked a figure so large and powerful that even the boldest dared not meet her eyes. Her name was Rala. Her skin shimmered like steel, and her steps echoed like distant thunder. And though she never raised her voice, nor lifted a hand in anger, still the crowds parted like water whenever she passed. She belonged to a race known across star systems for their brutal strength and unshakable pride, and even among them, Aurelia was a legend born in the iron fields of her homeworld, where children trained in combat before they could even speak. Where mercy was weakness and victory was law, Rala had won every challenge that came her way. She had broken bones and shattered weapons with ease, yet her victories never brought her joy. Instead, they carved deeper the silence inside her. No one dared speak to her, not even her own kind. Alien males looked at her as if she were a weapon, a tool, a thing too dangerous to touch. And though her armor was polished and her movements graceful, she was always alone, always feared, always distant. She didn't remember the last time someone looked at her without fear or disgust. Maybe never, maybe no one ever had. And so she walked through the station's long corridors, quiet and watchful, her eyes scanning threats out of habit, her mind always alert but empty of warmth. She had grown used to it. She had grown tired of hoping, and even more tired of pretending she didn't care. And then one day something changed. It happened so suddenly and simply that it didn't feel real. A human male was standing near the market deck adjusting some cargo crates. He was tall for a human, but still half her size, and he wore no weapons, just a toolkit strapped to his side. And as she walked past him, expecting him to step back or turn away, he did something no one ever did. He looked at her and smiled. It was not a mocking smile, not one born of fear or nerves. It was soft and curious, like someone greeting a stranger at a bus stop, like someone seeing a person, not a creature, not a beast. And in that split second, her pace slowed just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it. Her heart didn't race, but it stirred like a long-forgotten machine powering up after years of silence. She didn't smile back, she didn't even speak, but something inside her shifted, and as she continued walking, her mind replayed that moment again and again, wondering who he was, wondering why he didn't flinch, wondering what it meant that for the first time in years, someone had looked at her like she was more than her armor, more than her muscles, more than her legend. That night in her private quarters, surrounded by weapons she never used and medals she no longer cared about, she sat in silence and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't think about her next mission or her next battle. She thought about that human, about that smile, and about how strange it felt to be seen without being judged, without being feared, and without being forgotten. She didn't know his name, and he probably didn't know hers, but something had begun, something small, something silent, something powerful and deep in her chest. A question began to form. Would he smile again if he saw her tomorrow? And for the first time she hoped the answer was yes. The next morning came quietly as the artificial lights of the station shifted from soft blue to pale gold, signaling a new cycle had begun, and life inside the station returned to its usual rhythm of footsteps, chatter, alarms, and trade ships docking and departing in an endless stream. And among the sea of beings moving through the crowded metal halls, Rala once again found herself walking alone, her steps steady, her gaze forward, her mind more restless than ever before, because something had not left her thoughts, something small and unexpected, and yet louder than the clang of boots on steel. It was the memory of that human and his smile, she told herself. It was nothing, that she was foolish for even remembering it, that humans were soft and short-lived and strange, that he had no reason to smile at someone like her, and yet she could not forget the warmth behind his eyes, the way his shoulders didn't tense, the calm way he looked at her, as if she belonged, as if she mattered, not because of her strength or size, but because she Was someone worth noticing, and without realizing it, her usual path through the station twisted slightly, her feet taking her in a different direction. A path that curved toward the lower deck, where supply teams worked and ships were repaired, and where perhaps by coincidence, or perhaps by choice, he might be again. When she saw him once more, he was crouched beside a damaged service panel, wires in his hands, tools laid out beside him. He was focused, humming something soft, a tune she did not recognize, and before she could think better of it, she stopped a few meters away and watched his hands work. They were steady and fast, not the hands of a soldier, but of someone who fixed what others broke. And when he finally looked up and noticed her standing there, he didn't jump or freeze or turn away. He smiled again, just as he had before, and this time he raised a hand in greeting, a small wave, nothing dramatic, nothing forced. Just human. She felt her chest tighten in a way that was unfamiliar. Not from fear, not from anger, but from something that almost felt like confusion, because no one had ever waved to her before, no one had treated her like a normal person, like someone who deserved to be acknowledged without judgment or calculation. And she found herself nodding slightly, not a greeting exactly, but not a rejection either, and for him that seemed to be enough, because he turned back to his work, leaving her free to go or stay, and without knowing why she stayed a few long minutes passed as he tightened bolts and realigned circuits, and when he finished, he stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and approached. Slowly, not close enough to challenge her space, but close enough for his voice to carry, he introduced himself. His name was Eli, and he said it like it was nothing, like it was just a word, not a shield or a title, and then he asked for her name. Not like a demand, not like an interrogation, but like someone truly curious, someone who actually cared, and after a long silence, she answered quietly, Rala, and that was it. No questions. No follow-up, no mention of her legend, or her strength, or her species, just Eli nodding and saying that it was nice to meet her, and asking if she wanted to walk with him to the mess hall, because the tea there was terrible, but the view of the engine bay was worth seeing. She had never walked with anyone through the station before, had never been seen in the company of another, without them trembling or rushing away, and as she walked beside Eli, not behind and not ahead, she noticed something she hadn't before, the way others looked, not with fear, but with surprise, the way they whispered and stared, and yet she didn't feel shame, she didn't feel exposed, she felt like herself for the first time in years, not the stone warden, not the lone warrior, not the weapon of her clan, but simply Rala, someone walking beside someone else, someone who had been seen and accepted without armor. They spoke little during that walk, but it didn't matter, because something had begun, a fragile bridge, made of silence and trust and a single smile. And as they stood near the viewing glass watching sparks fly in the engine bay below, she found herself listening to Eli talk about things she had never heard of, about oceans and wind, about mountains that rose higher than the sky, and animals that sang in the night. And she listened not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because in his voice she felt something gentle, something steady, something healing. When they parted ways, he said he hoped to see her again, and she didn't know how to answer, so she only nodded, and as he walked away, she felt that strange stir again, that slow awakening of something long buried. And she knew without question that tomorrow she would walk that same path again and hope to find him there, not because she needed him, but because she wanted to. And that simple truth was more powerful than any weapon she had ever held. The station moved through space like a drifting island under the stars, with its engines humming softly and its outer hull bathed in distant light, while inside its corridors, life followed a pattern of order, and noise systems buzzed with alerts, voices filled the air with trade deals and orders and arguments. But in the quiet corners, where the crowd thinned and only the echoes remained, two figures began to cross paths. More often one was a warrior born in battle, shaped by fear and silence. The other was a human, gentle in tone, firm in belief, who looked at others not through the lens of fear, but through the heart of understanding. And though their worlds could not have been more different, still they continued to meet again and again. Elin never asked Rala about her scars, though he must have noticed them, some new, some ancient, running along her arms and neck and jaw like broken Rivers and steel, he never asked about her clan or her history or the battles her name was tied to across half. The galaxy, he simply spoke to her as if none of that mattered, and perhaps that was why she slowly began to answer. She started with single words, quiet and measured, then short. Phrases sometimes broken, sometimes clear, until one day she found herself telling him about the duel that had earned her place among the elder warriors, how she had stood against 5 challengers, how none had managed to bring her to her knees, and how even after victory, her reward had been isolation. He listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his posture still, as if her words were sacred, not because of what she had done, but because of what they revealed about who she was beneath the layers of muscle, beneath the legend and the armor beneath. The strength everyone feared, there was pain and loneliness, and the hollow echo of being admired, but never loved. He didn't tell her that it was unfair. He didn't give sympathy in words. Instead, he told her about the place where he grew up, a colony on the edge of human space where sandstorms came without warning and nights were so quiet you could hear the stars move. He spoke of his younger sister who had fallen sick and never recovered, and how that had led him to become a medic, not because he had saved her, but because he hadn't, and how every life he healed afterward felt like stitching up old wounds he could never fully close. Aurelia had never heard anyone speak like that, with honesty, without pride, without shame, and the more he shared, the more she felt a strange calm inside her, a silence that wasn't cold or empty, but still and peaceful, like the eye of a storm. And though she had once believed strength came from winning, from standing alone, from never breaking, she began to see something different in him, a new kind of strength, one that came from standing beside someone instead of above them, one that came from listening instead of commanding, from healing instead of hurting. It was during one of their quiet walks that a sudden explosion rocked the docking bay. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and a voice on the intercom called for emergency response. Ale was already running before the sound finished, echoing through the corridor, his medkit slamming against his side as he pushed through smoke and fire. Rayla was right behind him, her senses sharp, her body moving with instinct, not to fight but to protect. And when they reached the site, chaos was already taking shape. Injured workers trapped beneath debris, fires licking the ceiling, oxygen leaking from split walls. Without hesitation, Rayla moved into the wreckage, lifting metal beams like they weighed nothing, guiding injured crew to safety, covering Eli as he treated the wounded, while sparks flew and air thinned and sirens screamed around them. They worked like parts of the same machine, one with hands made to heal, the other with hands made to hold the world in place. And though none of the aliens dared approach her, all of them watched as the one they had once feared saved lives, without hesitation, without asking for thanks. And beside her moved the human who had dared to smile when the danger passed and the fires died and the wounded were carried off to care. Rala stood still among the smoke, her skin marked with soot, her armor scorched, but her eyes calm and focused. And Eli came to her, then standing with a small nod of gratitude, not the kind given to heroes, but the kind given to friends. And she looked at him, and for the first time in many years she spoke without hesitation, not about war, not about duty, but about the stars she used to stare at as a child before battle became her life. And he listened, and she smiled, just slightly, but enough to be real. That day the station began to whisper, not in fear this time, but in wonder, because they had seen something they could not explain. The warrior who was never touched, never spoken, to now walked beside someone who called her by name, and it was no longer the sound of armor clashing that followed her, but the sound of quiet footsteps walking beside hers. And the world had shifted, not with force, but with something far greater, something gentle and human and brave. They days moved forward like a slow current across the wide halls of the station, with the outer silence of space wrapped tightly around the metal walls, and inside those walls a quiet transformation was beginning to take shape, not a loud rebellion or a sudden clash, but something softer, a shift in the way glances were exchanged, and how conversations fell silent whenever Rayleigh entered the room. No longer was she only the feared one, the untouchable, the shadow of war that haunted the minds of those who saw her. Now she was something else, something more and less at the same time. More human, less monster, more present. Less myth. She walked the same halls, but now there were eyes that followed her for new reasons, some with curiosity, others with confusion, and a few with rising anger. Her kind had always followed one path, a single narrow road carved from survival and tradition and pride, and now some among them began to whisper that the warrior they once held above all others was beginning to drift away from the code, from the order, from the silence that kept them safe for generations, and they blamed the human for it, the small man with gentle hands and quiet courage, the one who had dared to smile, who had dared to listen, who had dared to matter, and it did not sit well with them. It did not fit into the way they had shaped their world one evening. As Rala stood near the viewing deck, watching the stars pass by like silent ghosts, a message reached her, a summons not official, but heavy with meaning, a challenge. Not spoken aloud, but understood with ancient clarity, the kind of summons that meant one thing and one thing only. She was being called to answer for the way she had changed, for the bond she had formed, for the strength she had shared with someone who did not belong. And she did not flinch, she did not hesitate, she simply turned and walked toward the gathering place. Without armor, without weapons, without the cold shield she had once worn so easily, the circle was already formed. Warriors of her kind stood tall with sharp eyes and crossed arms, and in the center stood an elder, one whose voice had once trained her, whose praise had once given her purpose. And he did not shout, he did not accuse, he only asked why she had broken the silence, why she had let herself be seen, why she had walked beside a creature so small and soft and short-lived when she could have walked alone and without a word. Riley stepped into the center and met his eyes, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something deeper, a stillness that came from knowing and not needing permission to feel what she felt. She told them of the explosion and the lives saved. She told them of the way Ailey had stood with her, not to use her, not to gain power, but to heal and to learn. And she told them that strength without purpose was hollow, and pride without connection was lonely. And though her words were calm, they rang through the room like thunder, not because they were loud, but because they were true. And still the elder did not move, and others did not nod, and the silence stretched long and sharp until one younger warrior stepped forward with challenge in his eyes. He did not believe in words, he believed in victory and in tradition, and he raised his hand not in greeting but in declaration, a fight not for survival but for the right to define what it meant to be strong. And Rala could have refused, she could have walked away, she could have said that she was done with the old ways, but she saw that to walk forward, she must pass through this moment, not around it, not above it, but through. And so she accepted, not with pride, not with hunger for battle, but with the calm of someone who no longer fought to prove who they were, but to defend who they had become. The circle widened, the onlookers drew breath, and the clash began. Not with fire or fury, but with control. Rala did not strike to destroy. She blocked and moved and waited, letting the younger warrior pour out his strength and rage while she remained still and steady. And when the moment came, she disarmed him with a twist of motion so fluid it felt like wind, and instead of striking a final blow, she stepped back and lowered her hands, and the silence that followed was heavier than any roar she had won, not by breaking him, but by refusing to become what they feared she had left behind. And in that moment, they saw not weakness but something unfamiliar, a strength that refused to be shaped by anger, a power that had found new meaning not in victory, but in peace. And though many still did not understand, they no longer looked at her as a creature alone on a path they could not follow later. Ely found her sitting alone in the garden deck where artificial trees glowed faintly and recycled air smelled faintly of rain, and he sat beside her without asking, and she told him everything, not just what had happened, but how it felt to stand in the place where she was once made and choose to be someone different, someone stronger in a way her people never taught her. And he listened the way he always did, and in that moment, she felt the weight of judgment fall away, not because it was gone, but because she no longer carried it alone. Station drifted like a silent ship through endless space, its lights flickering in rhythm with the artificial cycles that controlled the passage of time, and though the structure remained the same, though the metal walls echoed with the same footsteps and announcements, a quiet transformation had taken place not in systems or machinery, but in the hearts of those who lived and worked within its orbit. For where once Rala had walked alone like a shadow cut from steel, now she walked with presence, not hidden behind fear or silence, but side by side with someone who had never tried to change her, never tried to tame her, only chosen to understand her. Ely stood beside her, not as a warrior, not as a leader, not as someone seeking glory or power, but simply as a friend, as a companion, as a human who had seen the strength in her soul before he ever feared the weight of her name. And the station crew, who had once watched from a distance, now began to greet her with cautious respect, no longer unsure if she was a danger to avoid, but slowly recognizing that she had chosen to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than conquer. And it was a choice that came not from orders or duty, but from the quiet growth that had bloomed within her since the day one human dared to smile. She did not abandon who she was. She did not change to become smaller or softer. She remained tall and powerful and unwavering. But now there was balance in her steps, purpose in her presence, her silence no longer cold but thoughtful, her strength no longer a shield but a promise. And those who feared her began to learn that power alone meant nothing without the heart that guided it, that true might came not from fear but from trust, and it was trust that Ely had given her freely and without expectation. When a distress signal reached the station from a colony world caught in a growing conflict between two minor factions, it was Rala who volunteered to go, not with weapons drawn but with open hands, offering support, evacuation, guidance, and safety. And Ely joined her, carrying his medkit, his knowledge, his quiet strength, and together they landed on a planet fractured by mistrust, where entire villages had turned against each other, not out of hatred but out of fear and desperation. And while others tried to control the chaos with force, Rala stood in the center of the broken ground and did something no one expected. She listened to the elders who had lost sons to border raids, to the mothers who feared for their children's future, to the young fighters who believed they had no choice but to pick up weapons. She stood and listened and spoke not of glory or punishment, but of what she had learned, that fear breeds more fear, that strength used only for control leaves nothing behind but ruin. And when she finished, she did not demand peace. She only asked that they look at the ones beside them not as threats but as part of the same story. And something in her voice, something carved from truth and lived experience, reached them in ways that ships and weapons never could. Ely moved among the wounded, treating the injured without asking which side they came from, without judgment or hesitation. And soon the fires began to fade, the shouting slowed, and hands that once gripped blades now reached out for water, for food, for help. And for the first time in weeks there was stillness. Not victory, not defeat, but something better, a fragile calm holding back the storm. When they returned to the station, no celebration waited. No banners, no cheers, but that was not what they wanted. The real change had already happened in the quiet understanding exchanged between strangers, in the soft smiles of those who once feared each other, and the simple fact that a warrior and a healer had shown what unity looked like. Not through speeches but through action. Rala now stood as something new, not just to her own kind, but to everyone who saw her. She was not a leader crowned by tradition, but a guide chosen by experience. Not a symbol of fear, but a bridge between two ways of living. And Ely remained beside her, not because she needed him, but because they chose to walk the same road, one step at a time, across stars and silence and the unknown. And in that vastness beyond charts and coordinates, they continued their journey, not searching for peace, but carrying it within them, offering it where they could, defending it when they must, never forcing, never retreating, just moving forward together. And though many still whispered stories of the warrior once feared, and the human who dared smile back, those who truly knew them understood that theirs was not just a story of strength, or defiance, but a story of choice, of courage, of transformation. And so the legend grew not of battles won or enemies crushed, but of the day a smile changed a life, and a life changed a world. The end.